Oh hell internet! Welcome to another video on Hannah Arendt's Between Past and Future. This time I'm looking at the first essay in the book, and as ever I am an informed layman, not an academic. I hope this makes my approach somewhat more accessible, but of course this will be an essay and not a show. Sorry about that. The essay is titled Tradition and the Modern Age, and it goes into the theoretical background around the break in tradition that we've mentioned repeatedly in my previous videos on the latter half of the book. If you've watched any of those videos, then I hope you'll agree we didn't need to start with this theory. The essential character of the break in tradition is something that we are all aware of. Life has changed. This is something we've been seeing in commentaries ever since the 16th century. This time is seeing changes like no other, say the chattering classes. It has become a cliché at this point. But here's the problem. It is still true, and to regard it as simply a cliché and therefore as an unserious proposition strikes me as being fairly dangerous. I do also want to be mindful of the fallacy of assuming that there is some special and unique time we are currently living in. There is a balance to be struck here, of course, and that kind of characterizes the very point that Arendt puts to us. It is always for each new generation to actively place themselves in a relationship to history. This is a universal aspect of the human condition because the 10 to 12,000 years of human cultural history pales before the span of humanity as a species, and the mere 4 centuries of modernity even more so. A quick word on the term modernity. For Arendt and most historians, the modern age starts around the 17th century. I, like many, as a normie, have always thought of the modern age beginning at the end of the 19th, turn of the 20th century, but history sees it slightly differently. Our colloquial understanding of modern as meaning up to date does cause some confusion here. Maybe a better term will be forthcoming. But for historians, the modern age begins with a certain change of mindset that began around the Enlightenment. And yes, I know that the Enlightenment is regarded by some as a nebulous and Western-centric term, because it is. But Arendt is discussing the Western tradition here explicitly, and these essays are just thought experiments as she puts it, so they are somewhat nebulous themselves. Modernity will suffice as a term, but like Enlightenment, it is an imprecise one if we are not careful. The essay, like several in Between Past and Future, is split by Arendt into 4 unnamed parts, which I will name for narrative convenience. Part 1 looks at the tradition's beginning and end. Part 2 considers 19th century rebellions. Part 3 looks at the failure of those same rebellions. And then Part 4 looks at the dizzying situation that we are left with. Our tradition of political thought had its definite beginning in the teachings of Plato and Aristotle. I believe it came to a no less definite end in the theories of Karl Marx. Calm down. The beginning was made when, in the Republic's allegory of the cave, Plato described the sphere of human affairs, all that belongs to the living together of men in a common world in terms of darkness, confusion, and deception. The end came with Marx's declaration that philosophy and its truth are located not outside the affairs of men and their common world, but precisely in them. This is essentially a summary statement for the whole essay. Now, for any unnuanced viewers, Arendt was not a Marxist, but like most measured people in philosophy, she was not hyperbolic about him either. Her claim is simply that post-Marx, events have carried us into a new time. And he didn't do it alone, and actually it wasn't really him that did it anyway, but more on that later. What's important here is that Plato began Western philosophy by turning thought away from the world, returning only with ideas to impose from the outside. Many of these ideas have proved quite effective, but they've also led to the world alienation that Marx describes. For his part, Marx turned away from traditional philosophy to somehow realize it in politics. The beginning and the end of tradition have this in common, that the elementary problems of politics never come as clearly to light in their immediate and simple urgency as when they are first formulated and when they receive their final challenge. This is an assumption, but it does have some plausibility. A system of thought will be most present to those that use it when it is first instituted and when it begins to finally disintegrate. According to Arendt, Plato said that the beginning is like a god, which as long as it dwells among men, saves all things. This is a metaphorical expression of the tradition, a thing which resembles in itself a self-evident good as long as it remains vital. As long as it remains vital. Tradition, and specifically its beginning, is a fundamental chord, says Arendt, quoting Jacob Burckhardt. All human knowledge is accompanied by the history of the ancient world, as music is by a bass chord, heard again and again. The history, that is, of all those people whose life has flowed together into our own. Burckhardt was speaking of the Greeks, and Arendt builds on the idea that the Romans fused Greek culture into their own socio-political foundation, and thereby made it the fundamental chord in the symphony of Western culture, serving to bring everything into harmony. However, by the same token, it became destructive as it came to its end, to say nothing of the aftermath of confusion and helplessness which came after the tradition ended and in which we live today. Once external conditions change past a certain point, the fundamental chord can no longer bring harmony. This is where Marx arrives, as he sees it, to awaken philosophy from its 2 millennia reverie. Marx's project was to respond to Hegel by inverting traditional hierarchies of philosophy. Arendt identifies 3 such hierarchies: thought and action, contemplation and labour, and philosophy and politics. Traditionally, the first of each of these pairs leads its partner. Marx's claim as a revolutionary is that it is now time for the latter of each pair to lead the former. Unfortunately, he was thwarted by the tradition, which refused to give up so easily. The beginning made by Plato and Aristotle proves its vitality by leading Marx into flagrantly contradictory statements. Arendt will go on to discuss these contradictions, but hang on a moment. Doesn't that one line show that Arendt was wrong, that Marx is the end of tradition as such, if the noble Greek tradition can still thwart his upstart nature? Not necessarily. Marx struggled because he was still bound by the tradition's conceptual tools, and this led him to those contradictions in his attempt to capture his utopia. This will be a recurring theme throughout the essay, and just because Arendt believes that tradition truly is ending, that doesn't mean she thinks that Marx was entirely correct. There are ways in which it is completely reasonable to continue defending the tradition, and certainly we should retain what is still valuable. But Arendt is clear that she agrees that the tradition, as an identifiable thread in history, has been interrupted, and consider that her evidence for this is the 20th century. Arendt says that Marx's apparently utopian ideal of a socialist society with unlimited free time was actually just a return to something similar to the Greek polis. Greek citizens weren't labourers. To even be a citizen in Athens, you had to have some leisure time from labour, and the Greeks judged labour in a very physical sense. Thus, for instance, the shepherd could qualify for citizenship, but the peasant could not. The painter, but not the sculptor, was still recognised as something more than bonassos, the distinction being drawn simply by applying the criterion of effort and fatigue. It is against the time-consuming political life of an average full-fledged citizen of the Greek polis that the philosophers, especially Aristotle, established their ideal of scholae, of leisure time, which in antiquity never meant freedom from ordinary labour, a matter of course anyhow, but time free from political activity and the business of the state. There is, of course, another discussion about how Greek citizens came to have so much free time. Hint, it was because of all the non-citizens. But we must move along. Scholae is free time in the sense of being able to concentrate on things that are higher than labour and higher even than politics. But free time is defined by having something to be free of. For Aristotle, free time was a time for thought, and this meant that thought was, and should be, entirely free of the world and its politics. But for Marx, we are meant to be moving towards a utopian world of almost unlimited free time. So what would that time be free from? Marx might say that humanity would be able to shift towards a different and more enlightened mode of living, hence the fair accusations that he was unreasonably utopian. But much of the disagreement lies in exactly what counts as scholae, which is something we can discuss another time. However, it is clear that Marx has a problem in giving meaning to life after politics, and with it action has been abolished. Let us now examine how that problem emerges. Arendt identifies three of the fundamental premises of Marx's work, which she says led him to the contradictions. 1. Labour created man. 2. Violence is the midwife of history. And 3. Philosophers only interpret the world, but the point is to change it. Arendt paraphrases the third of these statements into the more proactive, the philosophers have interpreted the world for long enough, the time has come to change it, which puts the focus onto the present moment in time, giving it revolutionary character. Marx intended the working classes to inherit philosophy in some new and vital aspect, but Arendt is here to put a leash on that utopian exuberance. She notes that all three of these precepts are characterized through opposing concepts, which leads Marx ultimately into those contradictions. I will just go through the oppositions first before we get to the contradictions themselves. In the case of labour created man, she identifies 4 implications of this assertion. First, the suggestion that labour and not God created man. Second, because man organises his own labour, then man, through labour, created himself. Third, it is not reason but labour that defines us from the animals. And so finally, it is labour and not reason that contains the essence of humanity. This is my phrasing of this, and in my opinion, it allows you to slip reason back in with the word organise. For any labour to be organised, some reason must have gone into organising it. However, these are Arendt's words. Labour created man means first that labour and not God created man. Second, it means that man, insofar as he is human, creates himself. Third, that what distinguishes man from animal is not reason, but labour. That he is not an animal rationale, but an animal laborans. Fourth, that it is not reason, but labour which contains the humanity of man. By the way, this kind of ellipsis represents a subordinate clause with a clarifying detail or a metaphor, which is one of the things that makes Arendt very poetic and yet very frustrating to read sometimes. But anyway, if I were going to attack Arendt or Marx here, it would be that the clause insofar as he is human functions in much the same way as the word organise. This is where reason again becomes integral to the process. But then again, is that me just begging the question? Am I presupposing the animal rationale by assuming that reason must be integral somewhere? But if that is the case, then what else does it mean to say that man, insofar as he is human, creates himself? Furthermore, I believe that Arendt herself would disagree with Marx that labour defines us from the animals, because labour, the actions that sustain life, is something that we share with the animals. Introducing this nuance is one reason for Arendt's threefold expression of the vita activa, but again, we cannot tackle that here. In the case of violence is the midwife of history, the assertion is that violence is a defining part of any resolution to a contradiction. Violence is traditionally the ultima ratio in relationships between nations and the most disgraceful of domestic actions, being always considered the outstanding characteristic of tyranny. Marx challenges tradition here because, traditionally, violence was not supposed to be used as a tool of political coercion within a polis. But reversing this, Marx takes violence, or rather the monopoly on the means of violence, to be one of the fundamental aspects of government. Marx was assisted by 2 previous attempts to save political violence from disgrace by Machiavelli and Hobbes. These 2 philosophers were the first to seriously tackle the problem of power and the nuanced relationship between power and violence. Arendt has another, more subtle comment on how this second statement challenges tradition. Aristotle makes a twofold definition of man as a creature of both politics and of speech. This 2-part concept of man is designed to distinguish the Greek from the barbarian and the free man from the slave. The distinction was that Greeks, living together in a polis, conducted their affairs by means of speech, through persuasion, and not by means of violence, through mute coercion. Labour was to the Greeks essentially a non-political private affair, but violence was related to and established a contact, albeit negative, with other men. Marx's glorification of violence therefore contains the more specific denial of logos, of speech, the diametrically opposite and traditionally most human form of intercourse. Marx's theory of ideological superstructures ultimately rests on this anti-traditional hostility to speech and the concomitant glorification of violence. So by glorifying or at least licensing violence in domestic political action, Marx is again challenging the Occidental tradition that respects speech as the most human form of interaction. In conclusion here, one might say that the Greeks ignored labour's role in creating their world, but perhaps Marx ignored speech's role in sustaining it. In the case of realising philosophy through politics, this is not what a traditional philosopher would do. For all that traditional philosophy may have led to new precepts and ideas that can be applied to the world, it was not the philosopher's primary concern to change the world, and it was often left to others to take those new concepts from philosophy and transmute them into something more tangible, for better or for worse. By saying that the philosopher should now actively change the world, Marx again turns this aspect of traditional philosophy on its head. But it is also important to note the impact of realising philosophy in politics. Marx claims that philosophy can become native to the common world, that philosophy can one day become a common sense reality for everybody. Plato would have no doubt scoffed at the very idea of this, and it certainly is a very big ask. But in the modern mass society, it is at least possible to see how the free thought of philosophy could become more widely embraced by all members of a polis. It is possible, but is it likely? It would rely on governments enabling scholae in the population and populations embracing scholae. These are some of the ideas that made Marx a radical figure, and although Marx wanted these three statements to be provocative to other people, they ended up being more provocative for Marx himself. And now we're getting to it. Each of these statements contains one fundamental contradiction which remained insoluble in his own terms. If labour is the most human and most productive of man's activities, what will happen when, after the revolution, labour is abolished? What productive and essentially human activity will be left? If violence is the midwife of history, and violent action therefore the most dignified of all forms of human action, what will happen when, after the conclusion of class struggle, no violence will even be possible? How will men be able to act at all in a meaningful, authentic way? Finally, when philosophy has been both realised and abolished in a future society, what kind of thought will be left? Scholars have noted these contradictions before and have attributed them to the difference between the scientific point of view of the historian and the moral point of view of the prophet. For Arendt, all of these questions emerge out of the basic contradiction that Marx has been glorifying labour and action, and yet his utopian dream describes a world in which no political action or labour is necessary or even possible. And yet, Arendt lets Marx off the hook somewhat, because, as she sees it, he was limited by his own conceptual heritage. Such fundamental and flagrant contradictions rarely occur in second-rate writers, in whom they can be discounted. Well, isn't that convenient? In the work of great authors, they lead to the very centre of their work, and they are the most important clue to a true understanding of their problems and new insights. In Marx, as in the case of other great authors of the last century, a seemingly playful, challenging and paradoxical mood conceals the perplexity of having to deal with new phenomena in terms of an old tradition of thought. As Arendt suggested in part 1, the strength of the tradition does not depend on people being constantly aware of it. In fact, she says, it is only at the beginning and end of the tradition when it is explicitly present in the minds of humans. This happened first when the Romans adopted classical Greek thought and culture as their own spiritual tradition, and thereby decided historically that tradition was to have a permanent formative influence on European civilization. Before the Romans, such a thing as tradition was unknown. With them it became, and after them it remained, the guiding thread through the past and the chain to which each new generation, knowingly or unknowingly, was bound in its understanding of the world and its own experience. Not until the Romantic period do we again encounter an exalted consciousness and glorification of tradition. As I've said previously, I'm not an expert in the history of art and culture, so I defer to anyone who wishes to counter Arendt on this point. But superficially at least, it does seem that we see returns to Greek culture at certain points in history, including up to this very day. So, has the thread of Greco-Roman tradition really bound Western civilization? This is something that Arendt will explore more in the next essay, but it is of course open to question. And if there is something that we can solidly identify as the Western tradition, then something Arendt does not consider is that clearly other threads of tradition exist around the world, and these will interact with the Western tradition in various ways. What is the form of these interactions? The nature of these metaphors can be illustrative here, I think. Arendt speaks of tradition as both a chain and a thread. Both of these metaphors can be helpful. Each link in a chain represents a temporal region, maybe a generation or an age or an epoch, which might be helpful for us to discuss. But in reality, a thread is the better comparison. A thread is made from many individual strands which weave together to form the whole. Individual strands and subthreads can spread into each other to create cultural webs. Thus, all of the different ideas on Earth, hypothetically every single human, can be thought of as a single strand in a single interwoven web. However, of course, it also makes sense to say that certain groups of strands will knit together to make a single coherent thread, a tradition. We can also ask if distinctly different cultural traditions might have a different form. For example, maybe one tradition resembles cotton while the other resembles silk. Clearly, we have no serious conception of the actuality of any of this, but despite this, we can be aware that these kinds of differences are possible, even if we're not able to quantify them. For Arendt, though, the romantic exaltations of tradition were the first discordant tones to show that the tradition itself was becoming destructive. This does not mean the tradition had lost all power, and Arendt suggests that tradition can become more tyrannical as it loses its living force, presumably as the justification for it inevitably becomes, because that's the way we've always done it. This kind of dogmatism has historically been a common symptom of our resistance to change, and in fact, scientific thinking may be just as prone to it as previous models. This seems to be the lesson of the 20th century aftermath of formalistic and compulsory thinking, which came after Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche had challenged the basic assumptions of traditional religion, thought, and metaphysics, respectively. However, neither the 20th century aftermath nor the 19th century rebellions against tradition actually caused the break in our history. So what did cause the break in our history? Arendt continues. The break sprang from a chaos of mass perplexities on the political scene and of mass opinions in the spiritual sphere, which the totalitarian movements crystallized into a new form of government and domination. Totalitarian domination has broken the continuity of Occidental history. The break in our tradition is now an accomplished fact. It is neither the result of anyone's deliberate choice, nor subject to further decision. In response to the mass age, especially the French and Industrial Revolutions, totalitarianism emerged as the guillotine that has severed the thread of tradition. This is very much on brand for Arendt, who wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism, and of course this conclusion is open to question itself, but it is a plausible way to interpret the socio-political reaction to the scientific revolutions and terrible conflagrations of the 20th century. We can fairly clearly say that totalitarian, as Arendt would have it, did not exist around the end of World War I, and that it did exist at the beginning of World War II. If we agree with Arendt then, the emergence of totalitarian was the unique event that occurred in the intervening decades. The mechanism for this is that sometime after the rebellions of Kierkegaard, Marx and Nietzsche, everybody started to become aware that in the modern mass society, the old framework of tradition was no longer functioning as it once had. Postmodern philosophies bloomed in this fertile ideological niche, and these in turn enabled an evolution of political authoritarianism. Forget Plato and his reasoned arguments against democracy. You should listen to me, and only me, because of how I make you feel, how I play on your emotions, especially fear and anger. And you know that you can trust me because of the story I tell you, because without that story, you wouldn't even know what to believe anymore. And honestly, what does it even matter anyway? This is totalitarianism, and it is not a left-wing or a right-wing ideology. If you sympathise with horseshoe theory, like I do, then totalitarianism is the gulf of madness that lies between the two ends of the spectrum. But before I dive too far down that rabbit hole, I also want to pull back a little and ask, is totalitarianism truly a new form of government? Isn't it just tyranny that is enabled by modernity? Again, this is a question we will not dive into, but I suspect that Arendt would direct us to truth and politics and the modern art of self-deception. In any case, this is the situation that Kierkegaard, Marx and Nietzsche foretold, but they did not create it. To hold the thinkers of the modern age, especially the 19th century rebels responsible for the structure and conditions of the 20th century, is even more dangerous than it is unjust. Their own departure from tradition, no matter how emphatically they proclaimed it, like children whistling louder and louder because they are lost in the dark, was no deliberate act of their own choosing either. What frightened them about the dark was its silence, not the break in tradition. This break dispelled the darkness, but the thunder of the eventual explosion has also drowned the ominous silence that still answers us whenever we dare ask, not what are we fighting against, but what are we fighting for. I do love this quote, even though it is a rather vague and mixed set of metaphors. What is the dark? What is the silence? What is the explosion, and how did it drown out the silence? What is the difference between the darkness and the silence? And what is there to be feared? Different people might be able to make different and yet equally compelling answers to these questions, and that kind of sounds like it could be a problem. The essential implication is clear, however. Kierkegaard, Marx and Nietzsche travelled through the philosophical wilderness as it became darker and darker. They felt the foreboding of something hidden in the gloom, and they began projecting plaintive confidence that, don't worry, their own ideas could address whatever the threat was. However, none of them could have understood the nature of the explosion that awaited, and as long as that were true, that sense of foreboding could never be constructive. Their fear could only radicalize the old traditions, giving an enemy to fight against, rather than critically reappraising them, giving a new foundation to fight for. For these reasons, Kierkegaard, Marx and Nietzsche stand at the end of the great Western tradition, but they focused their projects through the lens of Hegel, who came before them. Hegel gave us the first vision of something that could conceivably have replaced the great tradition. The thread of historical continuity was the first substitute for tradition. By means of it, the overwhelming mass of the most divergent values, the most contradictory thoughts and conflicting authorities were reduced to a unilinear, dialectically consistent development designed to repudiate not tradition as such, but the authority of all traditions. Notice that this also implies that Hegel's project would equally undermine any other thread of tradition that exists around the world. This new ideological playground has thus been created, and in the West at least, Kierkegaard, Marx and Nietzsche were the first children to play on it and test it out, and try to break it. And the only thing that they could still do to try and break it was to question the Platonic hierarchy of God, world and man. Kierkegaard, Marx and Nietzsche are for us like guideposts to a past which had lost its authority, questioning the conceptual hierarchy which had ruled Western philosophy since Plato and which Hegel had still taken for granted. Arendt says all of this with an implied heavy heart, but none of this is meant to be conclusive or some kind of prophecy of disaster. Recall that the essays of Between Past and Future are just exercises in thought, and Arendt would not be making them at all if she did not acknowledge her own ignorance before some of these problems, but also a willingness to work at it. How can we benefit from 50, 100, 150 years of continued modernity? How can we succeed where the 19th century rebels failed? In some respects, we are better off. We need no longer be concerned with their scorn for the educated Philistines who tried to make up for the loss of authentic authority with a spurious glorification of culture. To most people today, this culture looks like a field of ruins. This fact may be deplorable, but implicit in it is the great chance to look upon the past with eyes undistracted by any tradition, with a directness which has disappeared in Occidental reading and hearing ever since Roman civilization submitted to the authority of Greek thought. So there is a note of optimism for us. Now that tradition is manifestly disintegrating, it is much harder to invoke cultural artifacts to enable the belief that tradition is still valid. Perhaps we should temper our optimism a little though, because, as mentioned above, a dying tradition can become tyrannical, and so it is much harder to get people to step outside their narratives to find something new to fight for when those narratives become defunct. And just to be clear for my own part, the current culture wars that are ongoing are almost entirely antagonistic. They are not an example of our reappraisal of the past, rather they demonstrate our abject failure to do so. In the previous section, Arendt introduced the 19th century rebels, the triad of Kierkegaard, Marx and Nietzsche. As much as she respects their work, she nonetheless claims that their efforts were ultimately self-defeating for a number of different reasons. In this third section, she expands on how this happened, and some of this is in tension with her earlier claim that they had no part in causing the collapse of tradition. This is not something I will focus on, but I want to acknowledge it up front. Arendt is right that the 19th century rebels did not set out to destroy tradition, but they did play their part. The destructive distortions of the tradition were all caused by men who had experienced something new which they tried almost instantaneously to overcome and resolve into something old. Kierkegaard wanted to assert the dignity of faith against modern reason. Marx desired to assert again the dignity of human action against modern historical contemplation and relativization. And Nietzsche wanted to assert the dignity of human life against the impotence of modern man. Arendt talks about the three rebels in parallel, using repeated turns of phrase to cement these parallels. I will instead tackle them briefly one at a time. However, by way of a primer, let me note that Arendt says that each of them were undone by a conceptual duality. Each of them wanted to preserve something in the face of oncoming modernity, and each of them failed. The traditional oppositions of fides and intellectus, and of theory and practice, took their respective revenges upon Kierkegaard and Marx, just as the opposition between the transcendent and the sensuous took its revenge upon Nietzsche. Not because these oppositions still had roots in valid human experience, but, on the contrary, because they had become mere concepts, outside of which, however, no comprehensive thought seemed possible at all. So these respective dualities were the only way that the rebels could conceptualize their own struggles. But these dualities were part of the traditional framework, and so, almost inevitably, they led the rebels back into trouble, much as we saw with Marx in section 1. Arendt cautions us, though, against the trap of saying that this proves the tradition's validity, because it does no such thing. It simply shows us how fundamental these kinds of dualities are. And, if we remember Arendt's referencing of Heisenberg in The Conquest of Space, the subtle ways that we define such dualities literally constrain the way we're able to think and the questions we're able to pose. But it does not express the explicit rightness of either one. As always, I'm giving this a Taoist spin in the telling, because why not when you're talking about dualities, but I do believe that Arendt will back me up later. Kierkegaard's move from doubt into belief was to reverse the usual effect of reason creating doubt. Instead, doubt gives Kierkegaard a reason to have faith. He was responding to the modern loss of faith, not only in God, but in reason itself, thanks to Descartes. The incompatibility of modern science with traditional beliefs lay in the conflict between a spirit of doubt and distrust and the traditional unquestioning confidence in what has been given and appears in its true being to man's reason and senses. Traditional religion is essentially a revealed religion. Truth is revelation. So truth must be revealed. However, Arendt goes on to make a distinction. She identifies the philosopher's truth, aletheia, and its attendant deilosis, explanation. And this is very different from the Christian's revelation, apocalypsis. I highlight these Greek terms here not just to be a bit pretentious, but because Arendt does. I don't do this every time when she does so, but when we are discussing the very beginnings of tradition, then it does make sense that we should use the Greek concepts that were present at that beginning, because the etymology will be directly relevant. And here it shows us that there was a disagreement between religion and philosophy over the nature of truth. However, modern science has become a much more formidable enemy of religion than traditional philosophy ever could be. Yet Kierkegaard's attempt to save faith from the onslaught of modernity made even religion modern, that is, subject to doubt and distrust. Traditional beliefs disintegrated into absurdity when Kierkegaard tried to reassert them on the assumption that man cannot trust the truth-receiving capacity of his reason or of his senses. For more on this, check out Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, or watch this space. Science and religion then disagree on the nature of truth because science is based on doubt and religion is based on faith. So it makes sense that Kierkegaard tried to use doubt to support faith, but in so doing he carried doubt into religion, and the result of this is that now religion and the religious experience became constrained by doubt and the challenge to one's faith which doubt embodies. Marx's leap from theory into action came after Hegel had transformed the philosopher into the historian, to whose backward glance eventually, at the end of time, the meaning of becoming and motion, not of being and truth, would reveal itself. This quote implies the common postmodern conception of metaphysics that nouns are subordinate to verbs. The process has more inherent value than the result. Marx, when he leapt from philosophy into politics, carried the theories of dialectics into action, making political action more theoretical, more dependent on what we today would call an ideology than it ever had been before. He superimposed the law of history upon politics and ended by losing the significance of both, of action no less than of thought, of politics no less than of philosophy, when he insisted that both were mere functions of society and history. Marx knew that the incompatibility between the classical and modern politics was in the lionization of labour that emerged from the French and Industrial Revolutions. Marx's carrying dialectics into action made action dependent on ideology, because any action would now depend on the result of a personal dialectic. But this robs history of its story, making action similar to opinion. This is how political actors were able to turn ideology itself into an opinion and birth the totalitarian regimes. An ideology does not have value at all if it is not in the context of a society and its narrative. This is another incarnation of the contradictions that doomed the 19th century rebellions. Nietzsche's shift from austere Platonic idealism to the sensuousness of life was a last attempt to turn away from the tradition, but in fact it only turned tradition upside down, depriving it of a foundation without replacing it. For this reason, Nietzsche is often accused of nihilism in the way he rejects Plato's ideas, which, hitherto, had given meaning to life. In fact, Nietzsche was trying to avoid the nihilism implicit in the coming of modernity. Nietzsche was no nihilist, but on the contrary, was the first to try and overcome the nihilism inherent in the reality of modern life. But the sensuous loses its very raison d'etre when it is deprived of its background of the suprasensuous and transcendent. We abolish the true world. Which world has remained? Perhaps the world of appearances? But no, together with the true world, we abolished the world of appearances. This insight, in its elementary simplicity, is relevant for all the turning about operations in which the tradition found its end. So Nietzsche wanted to assert the dignity of life against the impotence of modern man in the face of history. This assertion, as Arendt presents it here, is something that really defies clarification. How exactly does the world of the senses lose meaning if there is no suprasensuous realm supporting it? I believe we must be somewhat agnostic here, because without knowledge of the suprasensuous realm, or rather without the ability to express knowledge of the suprasensuous realm, there is no way to answer that question. The character of this conflict is shown in the confrontation between Nietzsche and Plato, or their purported patrons Dionysus and Apollo, but again, a topic for another time. Nietzsche's transvaluation of values, however, emerged from the incompatibility between Plato's ideas as standards and measures and the transactional values of modern society, and so Arendt now homes in on the concept of value, looking first at Marx and then at Nietzsche. Fair warning, this is one of those places where I am really unclear on what Arendt is getting at, but let's jump in and see how we get on. Marx knew that the incompatibility between classical political thought and modern political conditions lay in the accomplished fact of the French and Industrial Revolutions, which together had raised labour, traditionally the most despised of all human activities, to the highest rank of productivity, and pretended to be able to assert the time-honoured ideal of freedom under unheard of conditions of universal equality. This also carried with it the idea that all humans are equal in their ability to produce. This is restating something we saw a little bit earlier, but these two principles of the modern political landscape present this challenge to the classical model. Everyone's ability to produce validates every individual human action to precisely the same extent. However, Marx knew that the question was only superficially posed in the idealistic assertions of the equality of man, and only superficially answered by giving labourers the right to vote. So if action is what makes us human, and every human has the same ability to act, then there can be no special right to power, and in the extreme case, no reason at all to judge any system of thought better than any other. According to Marx, there was no way that the old systems in any recognizable form could survive this realization, because classical labor was an expression of our biological chains to necessity, whereas modern labor is an expression of human freedom, and it is this labor that produces value. However, we're not talking about all values here. Marx identified two types of value: use value and exchange value. Use value is the value that comes from people using and producing things, and it seems that this can be produced in isolation and has no impact on society. It is exchange value that is the value of such objects to society at large. Marx insists that use value is the more authentic and sees the rise of exchange value as a kind of original sin at the beginning of market productions. Use values, however, have no exchange value. This means that use value remains personal, and in any situation involving more than one person, exchange value, and eventually therefore all values, become quantified only by the needs of society, which bears the exchange value. The birth of the social sciences can be located at the moment when all things, ideas as well as material objects, were equated with values. Once this had occurred, everything up to and including the free thought of philosophy could now be an exchange value in society. Arendt says that Marx somehow wished to save philosophy from this fate because philosophy is supposed to be a part of that free time. Freedom must be expressed in free time, and so it must be possible for socialized men to actualize philosophy somehow. Put simply, Marx was trying to open up some kind of schole for the masses, as opposed to an opiate of the people. However, just like Kierkegaard and Doubt, Marx let the fox in the henhouse, because no matter what he intended, he subjected thought to the productive forces of fabricating society. This is part of the process we discussed in The Crisis in Culture, and I think it is fair to call it cultural Marxism, or possibly Marxist culture. This is a very loaded term, and there is indeed a conversation to have around it, but we do not need to have it here, and when we do, we should remember that Arendt's position is that it was not Marx who effected this transformation of labour. He was just noticing the effects of previous revolutions, and early economics was already working on that basis. In other words, the notion of socialized men, whose emergence Marx projected into the future classless society, is in fact the underlying assumption of classical as well as Marxian economy. This does not let Marx off the hook entirely, but it does undermine the hyperbolic rhetoric of some of those who see him and his philosophy as some kind of demonic force. Just grow up, will you? Sorry, I may have let my feelings slip in there. Nietzsche was not informed by Marx, and he did not necessarily think of value in exactly the same way. However, in his devaluation of values, he was also clear, and Arendt agrees, that there can be no such thing as a value-free science, and he was the first to demonstrate the doom of any attempt to create one. When Nietzsche proclaimed that he had discovered new and higher values, he was the first to fall prey to delusions which he himself had helped to destroy, accepting the old traditional notion of measuring with transcendent units in its newest and most hideous form, thereby again carrying the relativity and exchangeability of values into the very matters whose absolute dignity he had wanted to assert: power and life and man's love of his earthly existence. This makes a very potent finish to part 3. What is this tripartite thing that Nietzsche wanted to protect? Well, reading from Arendt, I think it refers to the brute experience of being an embodied person with a self-identity and a Marxian facility for action. There are those, Advaita Vedantists for example, who might believe that all of this is actually an illusion. But leaving that aside, Nietzsche claimed that absolute existence was the world and the people in it, including our identity and our experience. But Nietzsche was thwarted in creating any new values from this, because every value only exists in the presence of its opposition, which immediately makes that value an ideal object of exchange in socialized discussions of virtue. Worse still, some incarnations of scientism have gone to the point of claiming that new values can only be produced after the destruction and expunging of everything associated with the old tradition, and Arendt is not on board for that. She has always been, and will always be, an advocate of the importance of the past, and of course she puts that powerfully into prose. But that can also make us wary. This whole discussion of values has been very abstract and metaphorical, and this is only going to continue into part 4, I warn you. That last quote invoking Nietzsche is deliberately evocative, almost intended to carry the reader over the finish line of agreement without having them really complete a logical process. I want to notice this, but to be fair to Arendt and the 19th century rebels, what else could they do? The whole edifice of Western thought is designed to establish values, not ideas, and, as it turns out, even Plato did not realize this, as we shall see moving into part 4. Finally then, Arendt seeks to explain more about how the beginning of the tradition still imposes upon its end. All three of the 19th century rebels concentrated their attack on the abstract nature of philosophy and the way that its ideas came to be used as standards and thus constraints on human life. Each of them wants to restore the dignity of the human condition that they see as having been lost in the exaltation of thought. Kierkegaard wants to assert concrete and suffering men. Marx confirms that man's humanity consists of his productive and active force, which in its most elementary aspect he calls labour power. And Nietzsche insists on life's productivity, on man's will and will to power. All of them characterize their attacks as a turning or an inversion on Plato's philosophy, in which they try to assert one of the two aspects against its opposite as advocated by Plato. The turning operations with which the tradition ends bring the beginning to light in a twofold sense. The very assertion of one side necessarily brings to light the repudiated opposite and shows that both have meaning and significance only in opposition. Furthermore, to think in terms of such opposites is not a matter of course, but is grounded in a first great turning operation on which all others ultimately are based, because it established the opposites in whose tension the tradition moves. I told you she would back me up. I mean, this is pure Taoism now, isn't it? Each thing defined by its opposite to the extent that it loses all meaning if the duality is extinguished. The first great turning, which Arendt refers to, is Plato's periogoge, the turning of the soul, which creates the conditions for the turnings of the 19th century rebels. According to Arendt, the periogoge is rendered in 3 stages in the parable of the cave. These 3 stages are each themselves cast as its own turning around, each with its own particular type of disorientation. The philosopher in the cave first turns away from the shadows and sees the bright fires casting them. Then they turn away from the cave to be blinded by the sun and its light of truth illuminating the true world. Finally, they return to the cave and must then penetrate once again its dim shadows. And if you've been around my channel a bit, you might know that I have a fondness for the comparative mythology of Joseph Campbell and the tripartite nuclear form of the hero's journey: separation, initiation, and return. But this is not really the root of the issue. What Plato is really attacking is the very metaphorical root of something that came before him. Behind these turnings about, which Plato demands only of the philosopher, lies another inversion, indicated generally in Plato's violent polemics against Homer and the Homeric religion. The shadowy soul in Homer's Hades corresponds to the ignorance and senselessness of the bodies in the cave, and this Homeric reference is unmistakable because it is stressed by Plato's use of the words eidolon, image, and skia, shadow, which are Homer's own key words for the description of life after death in the underworld. The reversal of the Homeric position is obvious. Not the life of bodiless souls, but the life of the bodies takes place in an underworld. Compared to the sky and the sun, the earth is like Hades. Images and shadows are the objects of bodily senses, not the surroundings of bodiless souls. The true and real is not the world in which we move and live and which we have to part from in death, but the ideas seen and grasped by the eyes of the mind. Side note, Arendt says that the 3 turnings are only required of the philosopher. Is she implying then that the 0th turning against Homer is imposed upon everyone? Open question. But moving on. In the schematic here, I've nominally placed image and shadow as its own duality, and I will explain why in a moment. But this is not what Arendt was getting at when she says images and shadows are the objects of bodily senses, not the surroundings of bodiless souls. This quote implies that actually both belong together in one region on the side of the sensory world. In this context, image is intended to mean illusion. However, the word eidolon can also mean an idealized thing, and it is the root of the word idol, although admittedly not ideal. With this in mind, we could interpret Plato as representing the graven images of true ideas, as opposed to the shadowy confusion that characterizes the sensory world. On the other hand, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao, and so any image of an idea is not the idea itself. This kind of confusion is expected. The parable of the cave invites paradoxical interpretations, and it is in the nature of dualities that as we begin to approach the point of contradiction, the concepts will overlap each other, and it becomes harder and harder to tell them apart. We do not need to resolve this here though. However you choose to interpret eidolon and skia as used by Plato, the attack on Homer is clear, and this is the manifestation of Plato's turning away from the world and from action, which forms the beginning of the Western philosophical tradition. However, Arendt says, this reversal of Homer did not actually turn Homer upside down or downside up, since the dichotomy within which such an operation alone can take place is almost as alien to Plato's thought, which did not yet operate with predetermined opposites, as it is alien to the Homeric world. I believe Arendt's story here is that Plato's original inversion, the Periogoge, didn't quite do what Plato intended it to do, and so, by inverting Plato, Nietzsche and the other rebels weren't returning us to the classical Homeric place that he thought he was. So how does this work? Well, I think it was because of this next quote. It was solely for political purposes that Plato set forth his doctrine of ideas in the form of a reversal of Homer, but thereby he established the framework within which such turning operations are not far-fetched possibilities, but predetermined by the conceptual structure itself. The development of philosophy in late antiquity consists of turnings about and shifting emphases on one of two opposite terms, made possible by Plato's separation of a world of mere shadowy appearance and the world of eternally true ideas. He himself had given the first example in the turning from the cave to the sky. There is much more to say on the parable of the cave and the Periogoge, but Arendt here is suggesting that Plato's turning was not some idealistic step into a new world which negated the Homeric one. Instead, it divided the world into two opposing regions, and then it chose a side. It had an opinion, a political action with a political purpose. This is what was really done to Homer, and this is why I introduce eidolon and skia as its own duality. It was not until Hegel's insistence on the dialectic nature of history that it again became possible to think of philosophy in more balanced terms, with both thesis and antithesis having their part to play. Disclaimer again. If it wasn't clear by my tone and my earlier disclaimers, this, more so than usual, is extremely speculative on my part. For one, I'm not sure that I'm parsing Arendt correctly based on her own words, but furthermore, I think Arendt herself is making a fairly sweeping case from the ideas of the philosophers she is invoking. A real scholar of Kierkegaard, Marx, Nietzsche, or even Hegel might have more to say about this, and I am not qualified to judge. I'll leave it for you to decide. Beyond that, is this clockwork of interacting dualities even plausible, let alone provable? Are we justified in accepting Arendt's characterization of these turnings about? To sum up then, the three turnings of the parable of the cave are predicated on the great distinction opposing reality from shadow and illusion. But reality only makes sense given the validity, indeed the necessity, of those very illusions, or should we call them narratives perhaps. This meant that the 19th century rebels, via Hegel, were doing something even more radical than they themselves realized. Hegel's basic assumption was that the dialectical movement of thought is identical with the dialectical movement of matter itself. Thus, he hoped to bridge the abyss which Descartes had opened between man, defined as res cogitans, and the world, defined as res extensa, between cognition and reality, thinking and being. By introducing the spirit and its self-realization in movement, Hegel believed that he had demonstrated an ontological identity of matter and idea. In this way, the mind-body problem disappears. Arendt continues that Marx, at least in his earlier writings, was fully on board with this, and hence, Marx was no more a dialectical materialist than Hegel was a dialectical idealist. Idealism and materialism were unified under Hegel, and Marx knows that his repudiation of the tradition and of Hegel does not lie in his materialism, but in his refusal to assume that the difference between man and animal life is ratio, or thought. So Marx not assuming that humanity is the animal rationale is not strictly a materialist position, although, admittedly, just going this far could still be very unnerving for the traditional worldview. But in fact, for the young Marx, man is essentially a natural being endowed with the faculty of action, and his action remains natural because it consists of labouring, the metabolism between man and nature. This idea of labour power as being the metabolism between man and nature is hardly new with Marx. It goes all the way back to the beginnings of liberal economics, which is why Arendt says that Marx only co-opted the idea of socialised men, which was already implicit in our notions of value. His turning about, like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche's, questions the traditional hierarchy of human capabilities, or, to put it another way, they ask again what the specifically human quality of man is. They do not intend to endorse a worldview out of the answer to such a question. The 19th century rebels are not questioning Plato's idealism per se. In fact, they are challenging whether the dualities that come out of antiquity are even functional in the modern world, and they ultimately failed because none of them have a clear answer to this. However, we should give them a break because even Plato didn't realize that he was creating this dualistic framework, or at least that's how Arendt sees it. Since the rise of modern science, the conceptual framework of the tradition has not been secure. The dichotomy between contemplation and action, the traditional hierarchy that truth is perceived only in speechless and actionless seeing, could not be upheld under conditions in which science became active and did in order to know. Having shown the nature of these turnings about of history, I wonder why she didn't use the perfectly good word revolutions. Arendt concludes by summarizing the ground she has covered. Science and its Cartesian doubt questions all traditional hierarchies. When the trust that things appear as they really are was gone, the concept of truth as revelation had become doubtful, and with it the unquestioning faith in a revealed God. Theories are no longer judged on what they reveal, but by whether they work when applied, and in this process, Platonic ideas became first standards to judge the world by, but eventually degrading into mere values which have validity only as far as society requires for their exchange. This is how Plato's ideas lost their ability to reveal the nature of the universe. But for all of Arendt's forthrightness and confidence about this process, she cannot help but express her discomfort with this state of affairs in this unabridged final paragraph. These values, in their X and interchangeability, are the only ideas left to and understood by socialized men. These are men who have decided never to leave what to Plato was the cave of everyday human affairs, and never to venture on their own into a world and a life which, perhaps the ubiquitous functionalization of modern society, has deprived of one of its most elementary characteristics, instilling the wonder at that which is as it is. This very real development is reflected and foreshadowed in Marx's political thought. Turning the tradition upside down within its own framework, he did not actually get rid of Plato's ideas, though he did record the darkening of the clear sky where those ideas, as well as many other presences, had once become visible to the eyes of men. Okay, we are done, and there can't really be a conclusion since I did not actually pose myself a question. In fact, I have left many questions unanswered as we have gone through the essay. Please give your own thoughts below. But I do have a few final thoughts leading on from that final paragraph. First of all, Arendt seems to come down pretty hard on socialized men there, comparing them to the dwellers in the cave who have been represented throughout as ignorant, as unenlightened, as shadows of what is true. But that is Plato's rendering, and Arendt's admittedly melancholy mood contains no such value judgment on what human history has or will become. But there is a sense of regret for the certainties that have been lost, which infuses the 19th century rebellion, and which Arendt clearly shares. But unbowed by this, she goes on to pose these questions for future generations to consider, as it will be for them to organise the threads from here on out. If I were going to criminally simplify her position, I would create a contrast between two key questions. 1. What are the entities that will underpin the weave of the threads from here, and are dualities still sufficient for this task? 2. What are we to retain from the previous threads of tradition? Because Arendt, with her reverence for the past and its story, insists that we must be clear on this fact. Next up, I'm not sure that scientists would agree universally that the process of science has undermined the wonder at the world, although I do get the implication. The strict value judgments of science seems to strip something essential from our experience of the world. This is a part of the re-evaluation. How do we get back that thing that is essential? Or how do we accept the fact that actually it isn't essential and never was? And it seems increasingly that both of those questions must be wrong somehow. This ties into Arendt's representation of the relationship in time between the likes of Homer, Plato, and the 19th century rebels. Lastly, The last paragraph clarifies exactly how Marx represents the true end of tradition. It was not by destroying the ideas of Plato, it was not by showing them to be incorrect or even useless. Rather, it was only by introducing that final note of doubt, along with Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and many others of course. The end of tradition comes out of the human recognition of our own ignorance, these mass perplexities which Arendt often speaks of, those parts of the world which once seemed clear to us but which now are clouded. Ironically, this realization brings us back to the beginning and the Socratic assertion that we must first know that we know nothing. So how do we go on from here? So, has the great tradition ended? The very fact that I've spent upwards of 18 months now working through Between Past and Future demonstrates that I do take Arendt and her concerns seriously here. But I'm sorry, because I am going to cop out and say yes and no. Because whatever the form of history or its substance, the threads will of course continue on into the universal substratum. But on the other hand, to ask if a unified thread that we might call the Western tradition still exists, well, that is a valid question. But then it's also valid to ask whether the thread of the African tradition still exists, or the traditional Chinese, or the Native Americans. We really don't need to get emotional over this. In fact, one might say that at this stage in history, we need not to get emotional. But perhaps that is a very Platonic thing to say.